The idea of gardening vertically, growing plants upwards or utilizing small amounts of space is not a new concept. People have been doing this forever. And it's an opportunity to maximize not only your garden space, but to include more vertical elements, adding more depth to the garden. And I'll explain what that means shortly. But the image you see on the front screen here, this is a planter at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Wonderful garden, as you know. And in your area, you have beautiful gardens as well. I know I've done some talks at Berner Botanical Garden, Villa Terrace, wonderful area. And I think I did some presentations at Art and Bloom years ago, but this planter is in the Buehler Enabling Garden. So it's an all accessible garden. It's beautiful, and do visit. And I was able to go to Chicago Botanic Garden this year and get some images from this year, but we'll talk a little bit about these types of planters, but I think it's important to define the definition. In defining vertical gardening, it's important to mention it's not only maximizing opportunities that are limited in space with specific plants, planters, and other elements, but also, again, including those types of elements. Here at Rotary Gardens, notice those little 5-foot diameter planters in front of the building. Very small spaces to garden and to include anything for scale. So our volunteer carpenters, built these obelisks, these vining structures that we paint different colors to correspond to our color scheme. I still talk in the present. You will see a lot of images from Rotary Gardens, so I do hope you'll bear with me. I've been gone over a year now, but I certainly put my heart into the place. And I'll forget to mention it, but do know they are having their holiday light show, all COVID considered. There's all sorts of things you'll want to check online if you come to Janesville. But again, the topic includes growing narrow plants, training plants, but also some techniques. It doesn't imply garden limitations. It's not just, hey, I have a small space, what can I do? And certainly vertical gardening is your opportunity. It's also, how do I include more vertical elements and maximize the gardening space I have? So it doesn't imply necessarily small spaces with everything we're going to look at. But the idea of training plants upward, it's not a new concept. Here's some simple bamboo supports with twine. You see some Swiss chard along the base. There's also beans that are growing. Will cover that entire structure by the end of July. So this sort of approach is not new. And of course, the plant itself, the beans, dictate this sort of support. You wouldn't let the beans cover 1,000 square feet rambling over everything on the ground. Elevating them is the benefit to benefit the plant, but also the ease of getting the beans and wind circulation and all sorts of other benefits. So it's not necessarily a new concept, but you do want to keep in mind vertical gardening opportunities sometimes require more dedication and time. And using this example here, that's one of those shoe sleeve holders you sling on the back of your closet door, converted to a vertical planter. And my comment about more inputs relates to, imagine preparing the soil, making sure these drain, properly securing this. I pillaged this image. This is not mine. This was off the internet. I thought it was interesting. But do know that structure you see there is probably about 200 pounds of weight. So there's a lot going on to make that work and to make those plants happy. So it's not just a matter of tacking that up and hoping for the best. The limited soil volume is my criticism of those pockets, because not everything's going to really thrive in that limited soil. But you need to make a commitment to those inputs for success. And I will say, if you see my image, if you see me swatting, I have a November fly in the house here, which is embarrassing. And I'm not sure, I seem to be the target. So bear with me if I'm moving abruptly. I alluded to the fact with narrow spaces or small spaces, maybe you start leaning on narrow opportunities. For instance, on the left, that's an upright arborvitae called De Groot spire. There's many very columnar varieties that are out there nowadays that get only 18 inches wide, maybe 2 feet, and lend themselves to tight hedging, to very narrow spaces. These categories we're going to go into a little more depth. So when I talk about espalier, the idea of training plants to a facade of a building. Grasses, many grasses lend themselves to narrow situations because of their verticality, their colors, their textures, but also that form. Facade softening selections, the idea that you can include plants along the facade of a home, and there are inherent challenges with that and some dangers. And again, we'll get into a little more detail. Providing confined support, that's in essence, you're dictating the space in which a plant can grow. The beans you saw earlier is an example, but I'll show you some other fun applications of creating structures in a limited amount of space that allow for maximum growth. Behind the visitor center at Rotary Gardens, back when that was built in 2001, we were barely given a 3 to 4 foot section of soil behind the building. And this is a very sunny spot. You see a fall application here of blue asters and some yellow mums. So this was something else in the summer, but notice the repetition of these upright conifers. Xanthocyparis or Camasiparis is another genera that it's applied to Green Arrow here. But the repetition of those 4 columnar evergreens was meant to provide scale, but never be an impediment on the sidewalk. You know, 10 years down the road, you don't have issues of trying to trim this back. So the repetition of vertical elements is not only appropriate because of the limited space, but as a design element, the repetition of this narrow form brings the scale of this mammoth brick building down and becomes appropriate. You think about this little silhouette of planting space, a lot of that is what we have around our homes or in some of our narrow pockets around the landscape. And that's where narrow forms of particularly woody plants can be applied. If you don't have a room for a massive bur oak or white oak or red oak, here's a hybrid columnar oak called Crimson Spire. Here, it's late season coloration. And there's lots of narrow oaks out there nowadays that are beautiful for the landscape. And you see a lot of them in cities along parkways. Many are urban tolerant, salt tolerant, and ultimately, again, the canopy, while not getting broad, you think of a mature oak tree, these end up 50 to 60 feet tall and only about 10 feet wide, which is amazing. So these are real exclamation points in the landscape. This fine line Rhamnus, so this is a buckthorn, and I just have to say it's almost 100% sterile. It's not the European buckthorn that we have throughout our woodlands that the birds are pooping the berries everywhere and it's spreading like wildfire. This was selected, it's a hybrid, and you notice the very narrow form, the texture, it's starting to turn yellow here in fall. But look at the horrible spot it was given to be planted. That's 18 inches of planting space, hot spot, but perfect selection of the repetition of woody plants to not only, again, accommodate the space, similar to behind the Rotary Gardens building, but also providing scale along that stucco wall. I've photographed these for 10 years and they still look great. There'll be a point in time where their height, they may need to be trimmed down in terms of height, but the width will never be a problem. Espalier. Now, a lot of this is done in Europe. It's not uncommon. It's in essence taking advantage of a south or west facing wall where there's a lot of sun. These are, I believe, pear trees. And this is in the Netherlands, incidentally. Notice all the bulbs along the base. And in this case, there's a lot going on in terms of pruning, securing, training these plants. But the benefit of the warm wall is these are earlier to leaf out, earlier to flower, and earlier to fruit. And notice, if you think of an orchard of pear trees, the square footage that these are taking up is minimal. They're still productive, and they're helping soften the wall visually. And espalier, there's lots of references on how to do it, and don't be intimidated by the process, but there are some interesting approaches. Chicago Botanic Garden has espalier all over the place. I believe these are apples here. Notice they're being trained onto a steel support system. Interesting to note that none of these are adhering to the brick. There's air circulation behind them. There is space behind them. And some other fun examples. Here's a fan-shaped espalier, another apple tree, also at Chicago Botanic Garden. All you have to do is build a 10 to 12 foot brick wall in your backyard and you're good to go. But in reality, for instance, I have a vinyl sided garage that gets a lot of sun. I have an espaliered apple I'm working on as well. So you don't need a brick wall, but you do need, again, to keep on top of these things. Here's trumpet vine. I'm scared of trumpet vine. If you've grown it, you know it's vigorous and it sends out root suckers. At Longwood Gardens out in Pennsylvania, notice it's been espaliered. And look at the planter. If you look closely, it's a curb-edged 18 to 2 foot wide planter. And trumpet vine's tough as nails. But they're dictating the space that this will grow. They're snipping every errant shoot, taking care of any of the root runners. And imagine this in full bloom, the hummingbirds are all over it. So there's a lot of plants you wouldn't think would be possible to approach, like ginkgo. At Obelisk Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin, look at this wonderful ginkgo that's been trained along the wall. And there it is in fall. If you know ginkgos, their peak fall color lasts about a day or two, and then all the leaves drop. So it took years to finally get my timing right to get that photo. I'll back up and say, again, it's the exact same plant. And it's now wrapping around this wall. It's just gorgeous. And at the Morton Arboretum, this is another ginkgo tree trained to the wall. So imagine if this were in a space where there was no traditional garden, there's not a large space for a ginkgo, and you're partial to ginkgos, maybe there's wall that can be utilized again for this approach. Even tricolor beech, this pink variegated European beech being trained at Chanticleer, a beautiful garden out in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And this is a vine, what you see here, a container with boxwood, but along that wall, now this would be a blank and barren wall with nothing going on. Note this very small planter at the base of the wall. It's a steel frame that's accommodating schizophragma or Japanese hydrangea vine. Very silver foliage, interesting blooms, but in essence, they're letting that vine cover the support. And what a great geometric softening of that space. And it's very simple in its approach. And this vine would be hardy for you. We grew it at Rotary Gardens with no trouble. And remember I mentioned earlier grasses. Ornamental grasses can be a topic in and of itself. Number one, it's important to realize they're not just winter interest. They're contributors throughout the growing season. And grasses, some are vigorous, do know their growth rate and their form. So Northwind, out of Northwind Perennial Farm, Lake Geneva area, very upright switchgrass. The reason I show this is if you have a narrow space, an upright, rigid grass like this can have a lot of benefit. There are grasses that would not be appropriate for smaller spaces due to their silhouette and their arcing forms. But this is a great example. The feather reed grasses are fairly common. You've seen these all over the place. I don't think it's a ubiquitous grass. I think it's excellent. At Rotary Gardens, here's about 50 of them used in tandem. And this is a compact porcupine grass. So the gold banded grass. Gold bar is a wonderful one with a lot of banding. Again, grasses is a separate topic, but when you think of small spaces and gardening vertically, grasses fit the bill and ultimately can have that seasonal interest. Do know that not all grasses have winter structure though. If you want something that has winter structure, do a little more research because there's some that will just melt away and not take snow and such. So this gets a little prickly because, this is Boston ivy on a building on the UW-Madison campus. So taking this image, just gorgeous. And imagine, looking out those windows and seeing this coloration. Research has shown that vines on a building like this help cool it in summer. Research has also shown that the adhesion pads, the way this vine grows and secures itself on structures, are slightly acidic, and in time, over a great length of time, can start to deteriorate some of the mortar in these bricks. So I'm envisioning, and I will say a year or two ago, I walked by the same building and they had cut and torn the ivy all the way down, not removed it, but had cut it way back and are letting it regenerate. Because it's not unreasonable for this ivy to engulf that entire building. So this is that facade softening. Some people would argue I'd rather just see the brick and not deal with trying this vine itself. These are those adhesion pads, by the way. And this is on my siding at home. I have Boston ivy on a brick chimney, but it's gone a little bit crazy. The adhesion pads are near impossible to get off. So I had pulled off the vines, and it takes a pressure washer to remove these adhesion pads. So do know what you're getting into with any vines that cling. Now, a vine, this is another trumpet vine that's been trained in a corner here, and the homeowner is dictating its growth. This is not attaching itself to the structure and can be cut back severely. And the reason for using a vine on a support like this is if you look closely, there's not a lot of room to grow anything else, but there's about a 10-foot tall facade here. So the idea of incorporating a sculptural element, the trellis, with a vine helps soften the corner here when there's not room for another woody plant or grass. And certainly look into repurposing opportunities. That's an old spring bed frame on the left, and it's the same bed frame on the right with autumn clematis growing and doing well. And again, that vine is not clinging to the structure. It's just, not the house, it's clinging to the bed frame. And on the side of Rotary Gardens, another side of that building, only a little 3-foot space to plant, west facing, extremely hot with all that asphalt. All the gold you see there is golden lemon lace vine. So this is silver lace vine, which in its green form is rambunctious, and I would be wary of planting it. You can see in its golden form, this specific variety is quite rambunctious as well. But because of the 18-foot tall brick facade with nothing along it and only 3 foot of space to plant, we built 5 repetitive trellises. And so every year this vine regenerates. We cut it way back to keep it in control. But viewing the side of this building now, there's 5 of these beautiful yellow vines offering softening and interest. And there it is in bloom very late in the season. Again, the green form is an absolute thug, but the yellow form is a little more restrained. And here's that trumpet vine, again, being dictated. I've shown trumpet vine 3 times, but personally, I likely will never plant it in a landscape because it'll engulf telephone poles, and you can't build a structure tough enough to contain it for very long. But it's absolutely beautiful and wonderful for hummingbirds. But I do want to point out its use here is functional. It's separating space. There's a steel wire frame, very tough planting space at the base, but this vine is enjoying it, and it's very easy to keep this vine restrained in this situation. Here's a structure with more clematis and constrained support I mentioned earlier. These are tomato plants, and what you see, the colorful structures are all PVC pipe that's been put together. And imagine if you were to plant these 9 tomatoes out in your garden. You know, by late July, regardless of tomato cages or stakes, they're all billowing, and it's a mass. It's one big mass of tomatoes that you're crawling through trying to get at your tomatoes. What this homeowner has done with the combination of PVC and twine is dictating the growth of the tomatoes up through these structures, which leaves space for the gardener to get between air circulation, and she knows what variety of tomato she's picking. So she's telling these tomatoes, hey, this is all you get for space, so live with it. And in very strong support system, the PVC is over some steel stakes, so these aren't going anywhere. But I thought, what a great approach, because I'm the one who plants too many tomatoes that end up, covering each other up in the landscape. And at Rotary Gardens, we decided to build these 10-foot tall structures. And I do want to point out what's interesting. We grew a variety of vining crops on these, and we started to grow some fun things you wouldn't normally grow vertically, things like pumpkins and squash and tomatoes. The intent with this arrangement, notice it's sort of a cross if you're looking down on it. So instead of a square configuration, 4-sided, these openings allow access to the produce into these V's, if you catch my drift. If it were a square arrangement with 4 sides, it'd be very tough to get inside the structure. In this case, instead of a 4-sided structure, you in essence have an 8-sided structure. And the 10-foot, these are 3 foot in the ground in concrete. So over the years, we grew a lot of fun things. These are, I believe, mini pumpkins. If you're growing pumpkins or squash and training them up these structures, notice there is some mesh there. You're helping guide these, but also you select varieties that have a lighter fruit weight, 5 to 7 pounds. You're not going to grow Dill's Atlantic Giant pumpkins on this. You're growing mini pumpkins or smaller squash. But instead of taking up 600 to 800 square feet per plant, we're taking up 5 to 6 feet per plant. So we're maximizing our space and still having productivity. What you're seeing here are only 4 cherry tomatoes growing 10 feet up. And I think this was Sweet Million. And if you grow, it's a wonderful, tasty variety. And Sweet Million was applicable because there were so many tomatoes on this. It was unbelievable, and a great way of growing them. And we struggled to get in there towards the end of the season, but it was a nice way of training these plants. And this was a year I think we did squash. Anyway, these structures ended up being real helpful. And if you've been to Rotary Gardens, you've seen the painted obelisks, the colorful structures out in the space. Again, these get new paint colors every year. Most will accommodate vines during the growing season. But back to my comment earlier, we're putting these in spaces that aren't constrained, limited. They're not small spaces, but they're areas that we want to add verticality. When you think of a landscape, vertical elements, whether they're living or non-living in this case, help capture the eye. They help break up a composition. They can offer repetition of color and form. So this can be done with plants like the conifers behind Rotary Gardens or the colorful obelisks you see here. And I think I have a couple images. This is the same back of the building prior to the use of those conifers. So before we added those green arrow Xanthocyparis, we were doing obelisks. And this was a year, it was a red theme, obviously. And those are 8-foot tall obelisks. Again, leading the eye in a narrow spot. We couldn't compromise the sidewalk. That's also a fire alley, fire escape. And this is a really cool planter at Rotary. If you visited, you've probably seen it in the English cottage garden. It's a copper cheese vat, incidentally. It's an 8-foot diameter cheese vat from Monroe, Wisconsin, that we sunk into a patio and planted. And because of its narrow diameter, similar to the circles out front of Rotary Gardens when we use blue obelisks, in this case, a chartreuse obelisk that ended up having vines on it. actually had that Fallopia, that lemon lace vine grew up this by midsummer. But notice the trailing golden jenny, creeping golden jenny, some caladium. This isn't a partly shaded location, but as people came into the building, the windows you see in the distance, that is where people entered the building. So immediately they saw some color offered by this 6-foot tall obelisk. And we went a little overboard sometimes with obelisks. Right now, these all have holiday lights on them for the light show. But in the formal annual garden, we knew we'd have a chartreusey pink theme, so these were painted in winter, but just a different style of obelisk. These are all cedar, by the way, and we were fortunate to have some wonderful volunteers called the Grumpy Old Men, if you remember the movies, Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau. This group founded themselves over 25 years ago, and we have some retired carpenters that can build anything, but these structures certainly added interest. Now, we could have had some tall plants in the center, some additional grasses, but we wanted the rigidity of these structures and the repetition, the mirror imaging in all 8 of these beds. And certainly using them for growing, again, vining crops. That's a red curry squash growing up that structure. And snail vine, absolutely beautiful. This is an annual vine, but imagine that obelisk being bright yellow in spring, and as that vine started to encompass it and bloom, very, very showy. So the idea of having structures for our vines makes absolute sense, but the placement and utilization of that structure and the combination of the plant you select becomes a very vital and impactful design element. And I really like this one. This is a pole bean, golden sunshine. So a blue obelisk, blue and yellow always goes well together. And in this case, not the tastiest bean, by the way, but the gold foliage of this bean was, I think, awesome. And so that blue obelisk became a nice combination of blue and gold as the vine grew up it. And we weren't shy about snipping back on the beans a little bit if we needed to, just because if you look closely, they're already reaching out for the next ladder or anything else they can grab onto, they'll get. And here we are painting some of our larger structures. That's one of our great volunteers, Rose. We didn't let her out of this until she was finished painting the interior. But if you've visited Rotary in the last really 10 years, these pyramids built to accommodate the slope of the front garden. We did a lot of annuals. We did 150,000 annuals every year and transitioned 40% of the gardens was different every year. So this powdery blue white theme, notice the structures offer interest. The pipes you see there, I'm going to talk about a little later. That was another use of a vertical element. But here's the case where the structures are offering verticality. At 10 feet tall, we wanted to have something offering some scale in that massive space. And the year we did orange, of course, they became orange. And it was interesting. I had folks mention, they never used to like orange, but now they do after seeing this landscape. And then the joke, of course, where some people said, I used to like orange, now I don't. It was absolutely blinding. We tried to soften it with some maroons and some tans. I loved it. I love orange, but it wasn't for everyone's tastes. And so again, you see the same structures, different colors, getting into pinks and maroons. And these were fun 90-degree angle structures. These have a broad application in your landscape. And the reason I'm showing them, if you think about small space gardening, the thing you should know is there's a whole slew of vegetable varieties that are compact or shorter vine length, meaning think of zucchini, cucumber, squash, pumpkins. Traditional varieties, when you plant them, they ramble, they cover a huge amount of space. They just keep going. Short vine length means these select compact varieties only send out vines 3 to 4 feet. So they lend themselves to large containers or structures like this where the plants are trained to grow over this. So for instance, Minnesota Midget, this is a cantaloupe out of the University of Minnesota. See the structure on the left? The benefit to this structure is we're dictating the space. And this is a short vine length selection. We're saying you can only grow up this. There's 4 of them, 2 on each side. But it also elevates the fruit off the ground, gives nice air circulation underneath it. And, the paint color is nice. I mean, it looks nice, but instead of a ground level mass of growth, we're dictating the space. Not too dissimilar to what you saw with the PVC pipes and those tomatoes. And by the way, these cantaloupes they're only fist sized. They mature quickly. So in our climate, you'll get ripe ones, but they are the sweetest cantaloupe you've ever had. Some repurposing of gutters. When you think of, this is back to the topics I showed earlier, the idea that there may be some elements we can incorporate into our garden. This was one of our volunteers had some gutters, and this is, despite the shade, it is a sunny spot, but there's no more traditional growing space. So they created it with these gutters. Gutters, the limitation is soil volume. The depth of the soil is only 3 inches, but in this case, you can see perfect for greens. Spring sown lettuces, and those lettuces can be resown in late summer, and this can be a very productive space for 4 months of the year. Not my photo, but what interesting to see, instead of some of the utilitarian stacked block wall, we see a lot of the prefab blocks. This is in Europe, where they're creating systems that include soil pockets for planting. All the white you see is candy tuft. I'm not sure what the other plants are, but the intent with this structure, notice it leans back, so these pockets can contain soil. There are ways to irrigate this, but the intent is softening what could just be a very utilitarian blank wall. So it's a plantable space in a space that normally would not be plantable. And it'll be exciting in the next decade to see more and more of these systems, which are engineered for not only rigidity and function, holding back a slope, but also drainage and, again, accommodating plants. Elevated growing situation. I was in Amsterdam years ago, and it was amazing. Any bit of light in the city, there were containers with vegetables and flowers. And elevated growing situation is really a container. Here are some small tomatoes in a coir fiber lined basket, but you can include edibles in hanging baskets. The purple you see is coleus, but there's some parsley and Swiss chard in there. Hanging baskets with edibles, what a great way to elevate your veggies. But as we all know, the challenges with hanging baskets is the watering issue and wind and all of those things. Remember my comment about breeding in vegetables for short vine length? There are an unbelievable amount of compact and trailing tomatoes now. Batanto's one of literally hundreds that are wonderful for the basket. And imagine a landscape where you have no soil left, you have limited soil, or maybe you're in an apartment balcony, or you have to have an elevated situation where your fresh tomatoes are coming from a planter. All the same challenges with a basket, but do know there are these wonderful varieties out there. Most are determinate tomatoes, and the terms indeterminate versus determinate, like Batanto here, most of the fruits are produced at the same time. That's determinate. The indeterminate tomatoes are those that produce later throughout the season and tend to get a little more ungainly and larger for the most part. But do look for compact tomatoes. Here's another one, Lozano. This is a true trailing tomato. And my younger daughter, who was a cherry tomato aficionado, still is, we used to have baskets of trailing cherry tomatoes out in the backyard at her height, so she could pick them as she liked. And back to repurposing, a ladder here with some house plants and other elements. The reason this gardener used this ladder was the soil was so compacted with tree roots. Some of the perennials you see there were taking years to even get going. So she created an elevated situation here. I will say what you're not seeing is those pots are secured to the steps because the squirrels thought it was fun to keep pushing them off. But there's fun things we can do. I love, think about an 8-foot tall Menard style fence. It's a barrier, it's a screen, it offers privacy. In this case, at the Children's Garden at Dow Gardens up in Midland, Michigan. Notice these raised beds, they're right at kid height, and there's vegetables, trailing plants, beans, tomatoes. I see a lot of fun things in there. I think the danger here is the weight of all of that as it starts to pull on the fence. But look at opportunities vertically to soften fences and facades. And whether it's with attached planters or plants in front of these elements, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm not the national spokesperson for monkey pots. I don't get a kickback. There's a lot of products like this. The thing I liked about monkey pots, and imagine a deck, a patio, a apartment balcony with enough sun. These planters are all 12 inches deep, which is perfect for most vegetables, at least adequate. And in this case, 3 levels of planting where this structure is placed in an area where there's no traditional soil. So this vertical system is perfect for expanding or adding to your growing space. And there's all sorts of other systems. Stack containers you see. On the left there, that structure actually rolls and rotates. It's planted on both sides. And on the right, that's a steel structure. Again, on a patio. In this case, eggplants, beans, all sorts of other fun stuff. The danger in these systems is you don't want to plant unwieldy or really big plants up high because they will billow over and bury the neighbors below them. So you have to consider plant size and maturity compact selections are best for these. The soil volume is pretty limited, so the watering does become imperative, and adequate drainage is always important. And briefly, I just want to show you, at Rotary Gardens, pallets, these are, if you look in the back left, you see this is what bagged wood chips are brought in on. They're used, a forklift moves materials. Pallets are probably not a new concept to folks, but at Rotary Gardens every year we would generate about 500 of these. And we would never throw them away or burn them or anything like that. We would give them away as needed or send them back. Then we started seeing something about pallet planters. So we put 2 of them back to back, lined them with a filter fabric. Notice the slats, the existing slats, we widened into some circles here. And the intent, I think you're going to see, is putting it upright, filling it with soil, letting it settle, making sure it drains. If you look at the base of that, it's on 2x4s, so that most of the base does not touch the soil. And that was real important because we wanted excess moisture to wick out or drain out. But a pallet is roughly 4x4 or so in terms of surface area. So in essence, what we've created here with 2 sides, 2 faces, a top and 2 narrow sides is about 30 square feet of planting space in a 6-foot area. So the challenges with this were making sure drainage was adequate. This is heavier than heck, so we had to stake it so it wouldn't flop over. And I do want to mention, if you decide to dabble in this, because it is a rustic look, don't use chemically treated pallets. Look for pallets that have an HT that's imprinted on the pallet. That means heat treated, so it's safe for vegetables if that's what you're going to be growing. But we poked all sorts of fun things in these. Notice the stake right down the middle of the side of that pallet, because this was getting wobbly. And it started to fill out nice. This year there were Swiss chard on the top and sides, some white star zinnias, all sorts of herbs and other veggies. And again, imagine this in a narrow space, or a space where you're elevating plants above your existing plantings. We needed sun on both sides of this, so we had to keep that in mind. And these are all more compact varieties of tomatoes. You see marigolds, begonias, all sorts of fun things. It was a lot of fun. And by the end of the season, you never even saw the pallet. And we reused these for a couple years, and then they haven't been used for years. But if you get online and look up pallet projects, they're unbelievable. You can build benches and tables, and it's a great way to repurpose wood. Don't ever buy wood chips that look like shredded pallets, because it's not unheard of to have pallets shredded and sold to you as wood chips, and it's a subpar wood for that. Based on a plan from the Chicago Botanic Garden, we built this vertical planter. So imagine a scenario where you have no soil left. This is at our maintenance building, so you see no plantable soil. So this structure, same concept. You see wire mesh with some plastic. This is filled with soil, and then we're slitting in plants, compact plants, so they won't billow over each other. You see them starting to fill in. I do want to say, the first year we used this, we were seeing plants on the top were drying, plants on the bottom were rotting, and the reason was not adequate drainage. So when we drilled a couple more holes along the bottom, the water just came flowing out, and then it was fine. The issue with this is it was so heavy, it started to lean into that chain link fence, and it took a forklift to move this. This was about 2,000 pounds. It was literally a ton of wet soil and plants, but it filled out wonderfully with basils, compact tomatoes, hot peppers. So what we've done in a space that had no productivity value, we created this vertical planter. And there's limitless opportunities to do this sort of thing. But to remember my earlier comment when you saw the shoe sleeve planter, it's not always easy. It's not always low maintenance. You have to be able to dedicate the time to the proper construction, installation, and maintenance of all of these things. And just for giggles, I'll show you, we have a local PVC pipe extruder seller in Janesville, and they donated surplus piping. And if you've been to Rotary Gardens over the years, you've seen our use of pipes. These are jammed 3 foot in the ground so they don't move. They're painted with an outdoor acrylic house paint. Most paint won't stick to plastic very well, so it wasn't hard even with a thumbnail to scratch down to the white, but we were careful with them. There's only 18 inches of soil in these, by the way. So an 8-inch diameter pipe, we would get an 8-inch diameter mum pot and jam it in there and put some screws through to support 18 inches of soil. So this is kind of an artistic approach. The real Bearcat was trying to water these. So it was challenging, but here's a pipe that has dichondra, silver falls. This is an annual. trailing aluminum plant. And what was cool, in spring, it was just a red pipe with a little tuft of silver. By the end of summer, there were about 12 of these in front of the building. They became totally silver pipes with this vine coming out and trailing down. And then we took pipes and put them horizontal, put some openings in them, created some fun structures. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but even the support posts, we put screws and twine to support vines. Notice the pallet planters in the distance. This was just a fun approach to trying to grow vegetables in a different way. The minimal soil volume in the pipe and the toughness of watering became a real challenge with these, but they did become real curtains of trailing vegetables, which was fun. And we won an award for this display that year. And notice in the right foreground, there's that yellow support you saw earlier. So just some fun ways of elevating and using space maybe you haven't thought about or considered using. We needed a pogo stick or a ladder to get to these trailing cherry tomatoes that were 8 feet up, but we got there. And then the next year we did some other fun things. That silver you see is that trailing aluminum vine again. These are all America Selection winners. And the Urban Grow I give as a website, what they're promoting, and it's not an endorsement, it's a reference, but what they promote is repurposed piping. Imagine this on the end of an open porch, a sunny open porch where a stacked repurposed PVC planter system can offer an opportunity to grow as well. So you might look at these and go, that's crafty, that's neat, but is it for you? That's for you to decide, but just keep in the back of your head that look at your garden in a different way, because we always want to maximize our real estate. Our gardening real estate is so important. The real challenge becomes making sure we can maintain whatever we add or create in our garden. My home garden's a great example. We took a lot of sod out and planted a garden we have trouble maintaining now. So it's a matter of making sure you know what you're getting into. And we repurposed more PVC with some planters. If you've been to the gardens, you've likely seen these. It's all plastic there. It's painted every year. The bowls are 23-inch diameter, 9 inches deep. I did buy the bowls. The piping was repurposed, but it was fun to include these around the gardens. But all the same challenges of watering these. That grass, incidentally, you never want to plant in your landscape. It may be banned in Wisconsin now. That's blue lime grass, which is very vigorous, but in a container, not worried about it spreading. But in our children's garden, we built a lot of these. And if you look at those little corrugated, shorter, colorful planters, those were shipping tubes used to ship coiled sheet metal. So there was a business in Stoughton, Wisconsin that donated like 100 of these because they were destined for perpetuity in a landfill. And modern plastics have a shelf life of forever, and it's scary. And we know the nursery industry creates a lot of petroleum-based plastics, but we were just happy to reuse these planters. The elevated planters gave us more space to plant. Granted, the smaller ones didn't add space, but in the children's garden, what they did is they elevated the plants for the kids to enjoy. And that garden ended up looking like this. It was a pollinator theme that year. And so the kids could see not only butterflies and bees, but hopefully the caterpillars of swallowtail and monarch butterflies working through some of these plants. And we got the idea, and this was the grandson of one of our volunteers. What a great idea. This was Aiden's first garden. Aiden's probably a teenager by now, but he liked helping Grandpa out and he wanted his own space. So Grandpa said, if you can take care of this container, this is your space to plant what you want, then we'll talk about bigger and better things. And to my earlier comment about new gardeners every year, these are the gardeners we need to cultivate. And there we are, of course, processing them. I won't spend for the sake of time, but here with elephant grass, and this was the orange theme year, and you've already seen these images. It was a lot of fun. That gets into container gardening, of course, but again, you notice our use of non-living elements offering verticality. This is a 140-foot long border. It's only averages about 5 to 6 feet wide, so quite narrow, and it's always annual. So the challenge is getting height, and that's why height here and verticality is contributed with non-living color. Interior applications, spaces where you can grow, like this is a pouch planter. It has an internal draining mechanism. If you get into the interior applications of pouch planters or vertical gardens, do more research, because it's important to make sure you have a system that doesn't damage walls or facades and that the water is accommodated for, as well as the wet weight, as it's called, of these planters. because a lot of these things you can purchase, but they can become challenging. I borrowed this off the internet, but these root pouches, notice the industrial securing of these on the siding. It's not tacking a couple nails. And the real question here is the soil volume adequate for these plants? I would say absolutely not. I see strawberries jammed in here with tomatoes, so I think this was a shot to sell the product. But I could see this used for greens or more shallow rooted vegetables on a sunny wall. So imagine if there's no plantable space beneath this, this might be an opportunity. And Woolly Pockets is just another brand name. I saw this at the Michigan State 4-H garden. You know, chain link fences don't have a lot of potential. You certainly could grow vines if you have soil at the base. In this case, with no real plantable space, they secured this pocket. I question these. We've tried a lot of these at Rotary Gardens. Again, the challenge lends itself to the soil prep, the drainage, and again, making sure the plants can accommodate themselves in limited soil. And some of these wall systems are quite grandiose. At the Ball Seed Trial Gardens, where things like Rex begonias and house plants and other plants here in a shady situation are combined to create this cascading effect. And there's even now plastic cell systems. I saw these over in Europe at Cucumis, wonderful garden to visit for the spring display of bulbs. In this case, these were all forced bulbs inserted into these pockets, but Europe is decades ahead of us in terms of green roofs, vertical approaches, the greening of urban environments. But these plastic opportunities have a lot of potential. And here's one of those interior systems. If you look down at the bottom of the image, there's a capture area for excess water that drains to recirculate. So there's a motor, there's recirculating watering system. There's ways to fertilize these house plants. And the intent is the softening of an interior space. And these are pretty cool, these vertigarden cells. These are planted in a traditional horizontal format in the greenhouse and then hooked together outside. There's actually 9 of what you saw previously. Let me back up and say, you see a cell of 16. Imagine putting New Guinea impatiens in 9 of these systems and then securing them upright into a stack system. This was at a display garden. If you look closely in the upper left and upper right, you see steel cabling holding this up, but this normally would be secured to a wall and have a watering system. In this case, a stack system with moss roses. Softening a stucco wall, what's neat though, if you look on the side, it's not even touching the wall. It's not compromising the wall. Remember the earlier comment about Boston ivy. Facade softening with vines that adhere to the wall can be beautiful but problematic. In this case, very narrow soil volume, which is just perfect for these moss roses. And I love showing this progression. This is in the Garden of Eaton at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And this is a wall planter. The soil is replaced every year. It's similar in its construction to what you saw earlier with wire mesh and plastic, sharp drainage through it. This is a 10-foot tall brick wall here. This is a shot in May with pansies and parsley. That same planter in summer. The pink you see is trailing oregano and all the green is thyme. So the reason for this was not only softening the wall, but all accessibility and showing that these plants do not mind growing in a vertical format. But again, all the things we've talked about multiple times, the good soil, the drainage, etc., is vital. But seeing that same planter a different summer, that's 2 types of trailing oregano in the upper right and the lower left. And then that stripe of green from upper left to lower right, that's strawberries. So that was fun. And then I went back in October and saw the planter filled with all the white you see are heath asters and all the orange are compact snapdragons. So a lot of fun, but imagine, I mean, as a public garden, Chicago Botanic Garden ranks. I mean, they're awesome, but imagine shifting this out 3 times a year and then getting all the soil out of it, sterilizing it and having it ready for spring. So Rotary Gardens in brief, I know I'm checking my time here. I don't want to keep you all morning, but back to those pipes. We were able to obtain some old culvert pipes. That's what you see on both sides of the sign here. Those are also sunk into the ground and they are not filled with soil. Culvert pipes, by the way, they're galvanized steel. That's what would be laying horizontally under the end of, say, a gravel driveway. They accommodate drainage along swales and ditches. They last forever. And in this case, we put in some rebar supports to accommodate, there's garbage cans of soil in there with drainage holes. But we had a lot of fun with, if you look at the blue, you see this double barrel approach. These are 2 white pipes. Those are the planters inside. And there they are in that white and blue theme, back to the pyramids, but there's that blue lime grass poking out at the top. These also were not a lot of fun to water, but as people pulled in the parking lot, they did a double take, hopefully for the beauty of the composition, which of course was heavy in silvers and powdery blue, beautiful at dusk, as you can imagine. But we wanted a double take for them to say, those culvert pipes, what is going on there? And so we went crazy with culvert pipes, pipes that were pretty much laying in a pile. The year we did yellow as a theme, there it is with that blue lime grass again. And painting them all different colors. This year they corresponded to our children's program. We promote reading, usually a children's book. This was, Planting a Rainbow by Lois Ellert. And it talks about colorful vegetables, their nutrient value, and eating right. It's a great book for kids. That's all parsley planted in these colors that are represented in the book. And late in the season, these dead sedges, these are a type, they're totally alive in this image, but dead sedge meaning this is their brownish coloration. And they get Christmas lights, holiday lights as well, why not? And I don't know if they used them this year. And briefly, excuse me, urban greening. Again, this is over in Europe. There's a lot of this sort of softening. Pardon me, I gotta get a quick sip of water here. Really beautiful. The benefits are cooling the building, as you can imagine. A lot of the roof water is funneled down through this and recirculated. The challenge is a lot of new buildings can accommodate these systems. A lot of older buildings, a little hard to be retroactive and do it. But in the urban heat islands, the fact that our cities are so much hotter due to all the impervious surfaces, the pavement, the asphalt, the benefits of this greening, I think, are myriad. And there's still a lot of research on using these plants. If you look where this girl is standing, you see some moisture accumulating. There is a drain there, a grate that recirculates some of that water, which is actually washed through the system. Some of these systems are literally soilless. These plants are growing in a felty system with a synthetic rooting material in which nutrient water is flushed through it on a regular basis. So they're not adding the weight of the soil on the building. It's really fascinating stuff, not something that has really any home application at this point. Here's a system that's failed. I took that from the internet, but look at that whole system just peeled right off of there. Epic fail in that case. But in Vancouver, the library here had a system with soil in it. And I want to point out, if you look, Semi-Mu Library, if you look above semi, you see white. That's a panicled hydrangea. They had shrubs up in this wall. And granted, there's some open space, but two sides of the library had plantings. Just spectacular. I thought that was really neat. And so, some of these vertical systems you saw earlier, you'll see more and more of these over the years, and I'll go through these quickly, but they all require proper care. Notice all these plants, while growing vertically, if they were in the ground, would have roughly the same height. So in terms of a mosaic, they work well together. Again, some other fun systems. This one is just filling out. And what was interesting is the soil in here had shredded carpet it was part of it for drainage. And I think there was, again, a nutrient water application for this. This was at the Floriade, which is the big event in the Netherlands every 10 years. I went in 2012. The next one is 2022, and it's worth going to. It's unbelievable, unreal. And at Longwood Gardens, one of the best gardens in the country, this is the bathrooms near the conservatory area. It's the largest green wall in the world, I believe. And it goes way around the bend here. Those doors are bathrooms. But it's ferns, houseplants. Granted, there's still conservatory lighting above. They're in the greenhouse here, but a really amazing system of watering. If you look at the base of the plantings there, you see the same great system for recirculating the water. So as we close up here, I'll always endorse going to Rotary Gardens and patronizing your local gardens. It's vital. And as gardeners, we get ideas and inspiration from each other and from our public gardens. And I'll reiterate my comment about buying locally. And it's great to hear our local garden centers and nurseries had a great year. There's years that have been very tough for them, and it's tough to compete with the box stores and everyone's selling plants nowadays. But while we all want great deals, let's support the local people for sure. The winter scene at Rotary soon enough will be this, but don't forget the big light show. And here are some vertical elements in the formal garden. Notice a little different style of obelisks that you saw earlier in the chartreuse range. that's the formal expanse. If you've not been to Rotary Gardens, my replacement is a fellow I know well, Michael Jesiolowski, and there's some exciting things happening. They had the curveball, as you can imagine, with COVID challenges to volunteerism and et cetera. So it was a very tough year. And hopefully, in mid-spring when we have tree peonies and things leafing out, this is the fern and moss garden at Rotary. It's a 20-acre garden. It's going on its 32nd year next year. There's 26 distinct garden themes. It was started by a Rotarian, Dr. Robert Yar, and has over 400 volunteers. It's truly amazing. It's a skeleton crew of staff, but it's an amazing garden. Here's a sunken garden. And there's that children's garden again, where you saw pipes and other things at a later date. And hopefully the red buds, we'll see those in 5 months, 6 months in the Japanese garden. And you already saw this from a different angle, all the weird pipes and vertical opportunities. Rotary Gardens is on the site of an old sand and gravel pit, by the way. And so it filled with water about 100 years ago. And so the gardens is situated on these wonderful bodies of water, spring fed, and just a great place to visit. And what I'm doing now, the brief infomercial is I do landscape design consultation all over the state, Northern Illinois, a lot of public speaking. This winter, I'll have a couple different lecture series. My website, which is under the title there, will include those dates and times. I'm really enjoying working for myself, and the transition from Rotary was different for me, but getting life balance a little better in scale is nice. And I've done landscape design forever, so it wasn't a new shift for me. But I really enjoy doing things like I'm doing today, and that's chatting about plants.